Good morning and welcome to Quest.
We are so glad you're all with us today.
We miss seeing your smiling faces every morning.
But don't worry, that's going to change for some of you very soon.
That's right. Quest is going to be opening next Sunday, June 7th, 10 o'clock service. Can't wait to see you.
And we know that some of you will be coming, but some of you are going to want a little more time, and that's okay.
Yes, because as we reopen, there will be some changes that are made to accommodate some of the state and county guidelines that we've adopted and really respect. We know that some of those changes, frankly, are going to be easier for some than they will be for others, and we understand that tension. Everyone in the country seems to be feeling that tension right now. And so we haven't made these decisions lightly. We've discussed them and wrestled with it and decided we want to be prudently careful, and we can also always loosen up easier than we can get more stringent.
Yeah, and no matter what the changes we're making, this is temporarily adapting to our circumstances, but we worship a God who is the same. He is still alive, he still forgives, and we still have our hope in him. Even if we're 6 feet apart or with changes, he is still the same and worthy of our worship.
One of the big changes we have to make right now is asking for folks to register before coming to service. Because we need to keep the population of the building to 25% of our fire code number, we want to make sure that we don't have everybody showing up and not have seats for you. So the link will be available on our website starting the Thursday before service. As the demand increases, we may need to adopt a second service to be sure that we're able to provide enough space for anybody and everybody that wants to be present for Sunday service. But until we need that, our normal 10 a.m. is what we're planning on.
So when you get to church, we'll have a place for you to check in. It'll be outside depending on if you pre-register or not. After the auditorium fills up, we'll seat you in the downstairs area to watch the service.
Depending on the number of people that have pre-registered, anyone that comes without pre-registering will be seated on a first-come, first-served basis.
Also, the shuttle won't be running, so go ahead and park in the Quest parking lot and not down at Pond.
And we're going to do our best to keep everybody 6 feet apart. In fact, all of our seating arrangements by way of bubbles are 6 feet apart. So we've done a great job with that. But there may be times that you're going to have to pass by someone a little closer, and we understand. That's why we've decided that we should all wear face masks. And so we're going to ask you to wear those. I think it'll help it be safer for everybody. And remember, we wear those not for ourselves, but for other people, to be considerate and respectful of them. And so we understand, though, that for young kids, maybe let's say 5 and under, face masks may be absolutely impossible. They'll be pulling them off, and so we'll allow them to be exempt. But we want to encourage you then as parents to make sure that those kids, that you're watching them and trying to keep them from kind of invading everybody's space.
So when you come on a Sunday morning, you are welcome to bring your own coffee and donuts, but we will not be providing refreshments at the time being, or bring anything else that you would like to drink. We would just ask that you would clean up your trash afterwards, just to make this all easier for our group.
Also, be aware that our services will be abbreviated, meaning they will be shorter than what they used to be.
Don't worry, the bathrooms will be open, but it will be one person at a time, and washing your hands is a must.
In addition to that, we will also have 6 hand sanitizing stations around the building so that you can sanitize throughout your time at the building.
We know it's a bummer that Quest Kids won't be meeting, but we still want to provide your kids with fun and biblical teaching this summer. So in order to do this, Quest Kids has been working really hard to be able to provide at-home learning opportunities that will take place through videos and supplies that we are going to provide for you. If you are a Quest Kids parent, please, if you have any questions at all, send me an email at karen.robertson@questchurchstl.org.
And just so you know, the kids program is going to be awesome fun. I've been watching Karen and her team put it together, and they've done an incredible job. Now, not only when you come will we enter into the building in an orderly fashion, 6 feet apart, but we'll also be able to have you exit the service in a very orderly fashion. And so we'll probably have people leave 1/3 at a time, one section at a time, closest to the doors first, because we don't want to send people entering and exiting through the same area. So we'll give you instructions on how to do that. And you're welcome to socialize, but maybe when you get out of the building, and then frankly, when you're out of the building, if you want to stand closer or farther apart or whatever, that's your business. We're not going to control that. So, but just do it by mutual agreement, okay?
So that's a lot of changes that will be coming for Sunday services at Quest. And for those of you who maybe aren't quite ready to come back yet to the building and register for a service, that is totally okay. And if you want to continue to participate remotely, we would love that. And we have a lot of opportunities for you to still stay connected to what's happening.
Unfortunately, because of where we're located in Wildwood, we can't live stream our services. Our internet just isn't strong enough. So instead, how we've always done it in the past, even before all this COVID stuff happened, we're still going to continue to post our sermons online for you to view whenever you want. So we always try to provide the message video, an audio option, as well as the PDF slides. So due to the fact that we have to record it all during the service on a Sunday morning, the messages won't be posted until later on Sunday or Monday morning. So while we won't be able to post videos by 10 a.m. Sunday, we'll still be providing you with the same sermon content at home. But it'll just be a little bit different than how it's been over the past few weeks.
Well, we hope that this clears up a lot of the questions that you may have as you wrestle through this, and we hope you feel more comfortable about coming back. And if you're not ready, we totally get it. It's totally all right. But as we get into the swing of things, it's almost stranger to now re-enter than it was to shut down. And so we're trying to figure this out too. And though we won't be back to normal, because it's going to be a new kind of thing, but I wonder if maybe God in his providence is going to make this even better than we were before. And I think he's reached down deep into who we are as people, into our hearts and souls and our minds, and to say, hey, wait a second. I want to do something new, not only in each individual, but I'm doing something new at Quest. And so we're looking forward to seeing what that is and how we evolve to that. So well, I'm looking forward to next week, but I also am looking forward to finding some of the new things that God is doing. And so can't wait to see you guys then. But until then, as the staff, we would like to say
Bye.
Bye.
bye. Take care. You guys, we love you. Can't wait to see you in one way or another.
Good morning to you. Thanks for joining Quest Online. Here's the skinny. Thank you so much to everyone who's given to Circle of Concern. You've been a huge help in keeping shelves stocked at our local food pantry. It's a great way to serve the community during this time of increased need, so let's keep it up. While Crest will be reopening for Sunday service next Sunday, we don't want you to shy away from sticking together in prayer as a church. Prayer 111 is an ongoing movement to help us band together and pray together. So please continue in praying for one person at 1 o'clock for 1 minute. As things continue to open back up, we want to try to provide more opportunities to be together in community. We aren't totally sure what that's going to exactly look like because things seem to be changing so rapidly. But be sure to keep your finger on the pulse of Quest so you don't miss out on anything. The main ways that you can do that are through the email newsletter, our Facebook page, or simply visiting the website and checking the recent news and events calendar. All right, it is time for a bit of worship with Luke and Morgan.
Good morning, Quest. This is Sunday, May 31st of 2020. It's been quite a couple of months, hasn't it? And now, a week from today, we will start services here. For those of you who are ready, or for those of you who aren't, we totally understand this will be a rolling start and a rolling beginning into trying to get back to somewhat normal, though maybe it'll be a little different than ever before because God's doing some new things. But for today, we want to continue our series called What and Why? Answers that are grounded in faith and in hope. And we've been looking at a passage in 1 Peter the whole time. And in fact, the 15th verse says this. It says he wants us to be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks us for a reason for the hope that's in us, and yet to do it with gentleness and respect. And so really this idea, a reason for the hope. Let's circle it. Let's highlight it. Let's say, you know what? We want to give a reason for the hope that we have. So really what that says is if someone were to ask us, why do we have hope? That we could answer that I have hope because of, and the things we've been talking about is I have hope because God really is real. There's a reasonableness and a clarity and a conviction that God is real. There's something more than just us. And not only is he real, but that he is infinite, all-powerful, infinite. There's no end to him, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and forever. But also he's personal, that he connects personally to you and to me. And beyond that, we begin to talk about the fact that we have hope because God is sovereign and he is providential. These big theological words, but it really, the sovereignty means it's God's position to have supreme authority and absolute power. That's his position in life. But also his providence is God's activity, that he works, he's doing things, he's moving, he's on the move, and that he is guiding and guarding and governing his plan in all things. So when we think about that we understand that he is sovereign and providential, even when our world gets turned upside down and inside out like it has during this pandemic. So several weeks ago, we learned that there are really 5 elements of God's sovereignty and providential work in his purposes in all the midst of the tragedies and calamities that he permits to happen. One is to allow for the natural consequences of man's rebellion against God to have its effect. And that is what's happening. When we rebel, there are consequences. And that's one of the things that's happening in our midst, that there's sometimes even an execution of the specific divine judgment. And we can't always determine which ones are which, that God is doing what, but sometimes he does this out of his divine judgment. Another thing is he gets our attention in light of the imminent coming of Christ. If Christ is returning, he wants to get our attention. And fourth, to awaken our personal need for an intimate relationship with God. Today we're going to see a little bit more about that. But fifth, we're going to talk about the fact that there is the call of God's people to perform courageous acts of love in the midst of danger and profound need. It's one of the things that the Christian church has been all about from the very beginning, is to enter into difficult places to help people who are hurting. And so we want to ask, in his sovereignty and in his providence, in the midst of tragedy and calamity, what does that look like in real life? And can I just stop for a second and say, there are really kind of 2 different aspects to our lives. And we want to ask the question, or wrestle with, what does it look like for him to be sovereign and providential? On one side of our lives, we have these great joys. We have victories in life. There are successes, great adventures. We have strengths. There's highlights. There's exhilaration. And there's clarity. And we love that part of our lives. And we want it to be all about those things. But there is also another side to real life that every one of us goes through, that everyone in our family goes through, that everyone in our community goes through, everyone in our country and in the world go through. And there are things like disappointments. We all have those, don't we? We have failures that are our responsibility, that we failed miserably at things, that we have regrets. Someone has said, I never had a regret in the whole world. I can't even relate to that. I have regrets, things I regret doing, saying, and being all about. We all have flaws. We have weaknesses. We have lowlights in life rather than highlights. There are times where we feel despair, and times where we have absolute confusion rather than clarity. And so I want to look at the life of someone. What does it look like in real life? We'll look at someone in the scriptures. In fact, we want to look at it, this gentleman. This is a statue from the main reading room in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And this person is a person named Moses. Now, we don't know what he really looked like, but this is an artist's depiction of him. And it is a majestic statue because he's really a really incredibly majestic man. And we're going to look at his life today. There's a lot to it. In fact, he lived to be 120 years old. We think he was born approximately 1400 BC. That means that he probably died in about 1280 BC. And we want to look at his life, though. And he lived 400 years after God had used Joseph, who we talked about last week. And Joseph provided a safe haven for his father, Jacob, who we call Israel, and his brothers who sold Joseph into slavery. And then the Israelites found themselves there, and Joseph allowed them to come there as a safe place. He provided the way. God sovereignly and providentially put Joseph in a place of influence in Egypt. When his brothers meant it for evil, God meant it for good, and they found themselves under the having a safe place in Egypt. But eventually they found themselves living under the heavy hand of the Egyptian Pharaoh, who was using and abusing them as a nation as they became a labor class of slaves. And so into that we find the life of Moses. Now he has three different sections to his life. Really, from 0 to 40 years old, he lived out these things of privilege and power, but also pain. There was another stage of his life from 40 to 80, where really what we find is there was retreat, there was reformation or being reformed, and there was reluctance. And in the last 40 years of his life, we find that he leads, he loves, but he also experiences great loss. So this morning I want to look at those three things. And so let's start with the first section of his life, from 0 to 40 years old. And we find here in a very unique way that he grew up the adopted son of the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, as the people had been serving there and living in Egypt, they had become numerous. And in fact, the more work they were given, the harsher they were treated, the greater they grew. And all of a sudden, there were so many that Pharaoh was afraid of them. And so he said, we need to put a stop to this. And so we need to have every boy who's born, we need to have them thrown into the Nile. Let's eliminate the future of these people. And so he ordered that, but it didn't work very well because some of the midwives who were helping birth these children knew it was wrong and they didn't cooperate. But it brings us to Exodus chapter 2. When it tells the story of the birth of Moses. Look at this in verse 1. It says, now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. So within the same tribe of Israel, a man marries this woman. This is Moses' father and mother. And it says that the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. See, they were supposed to kill these children. And so she refused to do that. Like all the other women of Israel, they refused to kill these kids. And so she kept him for 3 months, privately, quietly. But look at verse 3. When she could hide him no longer, because eventually a 3-month-old has a tendency to cry a lot, to begin to babble a lot, and it's hard to keep them quiet, right? So she hid it when she could no longer hide him. She took him in a basket made of bulrushes. Those are kind of like reeds, like you'd make a basket, a woven basket, and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. That's kind of a sealant, a water seal that she put around this basket. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Now, she put it in there trusting that God would protect his life in some way, shape, or form. And so in verse 4 it says that his sister, this is Miriam, and we're going to see Miriam again in this story in about 100 years. But it says his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done with him. In God's providence and in God's sovereignty, it says, look, now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the water, and while her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. She said, what is that over there? And look at this in verse 6. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. I want to say, well, no brainer, of course. You put a child in a basket and start floating it in a river, probably the baby's going to cry. And she took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. Now she knew they were supposed to be being killed, but she took pity. In God's sovereignty, he put it in this woman's heart to care for this child. It says, then his sister, this is Miriam again, said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? You're not able to do it. Should I get one of these Hebrew women to do it? And Pharaoh's daughter said, go, of course, do it now. And so the girl went and called the child's mother. Obviously, this would be the best solution for the mother to continue nurturing this child. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. I'll pay you to do this. She didn't necessarily know it was Moses' mother, but she said, please, thank you, do this, and I'll pay you. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And look at this in verse 10. And then the child grew up, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Now, we don't know exactly when, but the scriptures seem to suggest, and the wording of this is probably after he was weaned, after he no longer needed to breastfeed, that when the child was ready to be able to be on his own, at least in the feeding process, that she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. This is maybe 6 months, a year, maybe a little longer, but probably right in there. And it says, and he became her son. He's now the adopted son of the daughter of Pharaoh. And she named him Moses, which is an Egyptian name, because she said, I drew him out of the water. That's what Moses means, to be drawn out of the water, to be drawn out of the Nile. And so she named him Moses. And then we skip a bunch of years here, probably almost 40, maybe 38, 39 years. In verse 11 it says, one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people. He knew he was a Hebrew. And though he had grown up in privilege and had grown up in power, he hadn't forgotten who he was. And he went out to his people and he looked on their burdens because they were being treated so poorly. And in fact, in one situation, it says that he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Can you imagine the conflict in him, the pain inside his own life? As he's lived in privilege as one of the Egyptians, and yet his people were being mistreated. And here he sees one particular who's being beaten by this man. And so in verse 12, he says, he looked this way and that way. And seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He murdered him and he buried him. You see, I think Moses had this sense of justice. Unfortunately, he took justice into his own hands and he murdered this man. Now look in verse 13. He says, when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man who was in the wrong, he said, why do you strike your companion? And he got an answer back from him that was very difficult, because this Hebrew answered and he said, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses was afraid, and he thought, surely this thing is known. And in fact, it was. Look in verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to execute justice on Moses, and he sought to kill him. That's an incredible thought, isn't it? Well, this brings us to a whole new season in Moses' life. Because we know that what he did is he ran away. He retreated. And in fact, the scriptures tell us that he retreated to a place called Midian. Now, here's a map of the area. Egypt over here with the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula in the middle. But way over here in modern day, Saudi Arabia is where he goes to the land of Midian. It's about 250 miles as the crow flies. But you don't get there as the crow flies back in 1300 BC. Because look at it, this is what the Sinai looks like. It's a desolate, barren wilderness of dry, brutal mountains. And he had to walk through this. And when he got to Midian, it wasn't much better. Look at this picture of Midian. It's a dry and desolate place. And so when he went there to escape, he settled among the people of Midian and among the priest of Midian named Jethro. And look at this in Exodus chapter 2. It says, "And Moses was content to dwell with the man Jethro, the priest of Midian." He had run away, he had settled down, and he was content. And it goes on and he says, "And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah." So he escapes, he finds a place to live, he's given a beautiful wife, Zipporah. And look at verse 22. "She gave birth to a son, and she called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a sojourner, exiled in a foreign land." That's what Gershom means, the exiled. In verse 23, "During those days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of the slavery and cried out for help." And this is a beautiful sentence. Look at this. "Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. God heard it, and he cared. And he was looking for solution, and he found solution, and he made solution." Look at this. "And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In the midst of their pain, God was aware, and God was beginning to move in the midst of that." Now look at this in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God." This is an incredibly important mountain in the Old Testament. It's known as Horeb, in some places known as Mount Sinai in other places. But this is a place where Moses returned to time and time again to meet with his God. In verse 2, it says that the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Somehow this miraculous thing is happening, and he's perplexed by it. And Moses said, "I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." Of course, you and I would probably do the same. "And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush." Now that had to be a little bit of a freaky experience. But God called to him out of the bush, and he said, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Like, what else am I going to say? He heard God's voice calling him, and he said, "Here I am." He presented it. Rather than running away, he said, "Here I am." And then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet. For the place on which you are standing is holy ground. In the presence of God is holy ground." Can you imagine what Moses is beginning to sense? Something is going on. God is doing something. I'm content. I've got a family, but my people that God is listening to. And God comes to Moses, and he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And what did Moses do? It says that Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Something incredible was happening. Verse 7 then, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard the cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I'm aware and I care. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad place, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. And I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. And then he says in verse 10, come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. What an amazing call, isn't it? How stunning. How awesome is that? And you'd think Moses, man, I've just seen God in a burning bush and he has spoken to me. And he's told me about how much he cares for our people. Let's go. Well, there is lots of reluctance. Look at this in verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I to do that? And I want to say, well, who else is going to do it? I mean, you're obviously the guy. You grew up in Pharaoh's home. You understand the culture. You know everything about it. You know the people. You're the perfect guy to do it. And he says, who am I to do this? And God says to him, I'll be with you. And this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you, that you have brought the people out of Egypt. You shall serve God on this mountain. I'm going to be with you. You have nothing to fear. I'm going to be right there with you. And then Moses says, okay, then let's go. No, that's not what he says. Look at verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they're going to ask me, what's his name? What shall I say to them? I don't know this very well. God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is his memorial name. I am who I am. I have always been, I am, and I will always be. I simply am. And he says, say this to the people of Israel, I am, has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses here in verse 15, he says, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. I am that I am. What an incredible call. Well, wouldn't you just jump at it then, right? No, look at this. He's still reluctant. Verse 1 of chapter 4. And then Moses answered, and he said, hey, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord didn't appear to you. You're crazy. You're out of your mind. And then God begins to say, I'm going to show you. I am going to do miraculous signs to prove my authority. And he says, take your staff and throw it on the ground. And he did it. It turned into a snake. And God said, pick it up. And it became by the tail and became a staff again. He said, hey, Moses, take your hand and stick it inside your cloak. And when he pulled it out, it was leprous, like snow, white, deformed and decaying skin. He said, stick it back in your coat. And when he did and pulled it out, it was healed. And he said, and if they don't believe those, when you get there, take water out of the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it'll turn into blood. There that we'd see the awesome power of God. But even that, Moses was still reluctant. He said, but Moses said to him in verse 10, to the Lord, oh my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue. I have a stutter. I don't speak well. I can't do this. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Am I not the one who can do this through you? No matter what your disability might be, I can use you. I'll work through you. God begins a little frustrated here, I think, with Moses. And in verse 12 he says, "Now therefore go, and I will be with you. I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall speak." Once again, he's reluctant. Look at this in verse 13. But he said, "Oh my Lord, please send somebody else. Can't you find somebody else to do this?" It says, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite?" It's like God says, I'm frustrated with you, but if I have to use some others with you, but you're not getting off the hook here. Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. And in fact, he did at the mountain of God, the mountain of Horeb. And when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart because he hasn't seen you for almost 40 years. Verse 15, you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth, Moses, and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, Moses, and you shall be as God to him, used by me through you, Moses, to help Aaron. You're not getting off the hook. Moses, I'm calling you. Stop coming up with excuses. I'll be with you. I'll teach you. And you'll teach him. And so he says, in taking your hand this staff, with which you shall do the signs. Wow, that's an incredible thought, isn't it? But in this whole thing, he's retreated, but God has met him and reformed his heart, but he's incredibly reluctant. But then it comes to the third piece of his life, where he needs to lead and to love and experience loss. Look at this in chapter 4 of Exodus. It says that Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt and see if they are still alive." He finally obeyed. And he said, okay. And his father-in-law Jethro says to Moses, "Go in peace." And he blessed him to go. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead." You see, that wasn't told him until after he obeyed. He was afraid before. He says, all those men that you're seeking your life are dead. And so Moses took his wife and his sons, and he had them ride on a donkey. Nice of him. He gets to walk, they get to ride. And he went back to the land of Egypt. Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And then for the next 40 years, he faithfully led a grumbling, complaining, faithless, rebellious group of men, women, and children through the wilderness. And there are all sorts of things that happen in this story that we can't touch on today. But what I want to do is I want to jump forward to Exodus chapter 17. And begin to see the way he led and the way he loved and even the loss that he experienced. So look at Exodus 17, verse 1. It says, this is about 4 months into their journey in the wilderness, having crossed the Red Sea, having gone through the 10 plagues of Egypt, having gone into the wilderness, having manna to eat and quail to eat that God supplies all the time for them. And it says, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, encamped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. And you saw the picture. It is a dry and desolate place. Verse 2 says, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And if I were Moses, I would have said, "I'd love to, but look at this place. There's no water to be found." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? I'm trying to obey him. But you seem to want to quarrel with him and quarrel with me. All you do is complain." But verse 3 says, but the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? What kind of knucklehead are you, Moses?" And if I were Moses, I'd probably say, "Hey, look, I quit. I'm going back to Midian. Find your own way. So Moses cries out to the Lord, though. Rather than get in a fight with these people, he calls out to the Lord. It's probably one of the greatest qualities that we find in Moses. He went to the Lord in the midst of the difficulties. He cried out and he said, what shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to kill me, to stone me. God, what do I do? In verse 5, it says that the Lord said to Moses, Moses, here's what I want you to do. Pass on before the people, taking you with you some of the elders of Israel. Don't run away from them. For those who are your naysayers, don't run away from them. Face them, be with them. Take some of the elders with you, and take in your hand the staff with which I struck the Nile, and go. That represented God's presence. And he says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And they called the name of that place Massah, which means test, or Meribah, which means contention, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel. And because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Can you imagine? He strikes the rock. He's told to strike it. And out came enough water for millions of people. It wasn't just a trickle. It wasn't a drinking fountain. It was a river of water that they needed. And God supplied. And God, in this, as Moses led them, God called him to love them, to not fight with them, though I certainly would have thought that would be fair. But he said, love them. Put up with their complaining. I'm calling you to lead and to love. Wow, that's incredible. Now, I want to go to another time. This same thing happened 40 years later, just before they went into the promised land. At the same place, they've been wandering around. Look in Numbers chapter 20. It says, now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled together against Moses and against Aaron. At least Aaron gets in on it this time. And the people quarreled with Moses. Once again, they quarrel. And they said, what that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? Once again, they need water. They're complaining. They're tired. Right before this happened, Moses' sister Miriam had passed away. And so Moses is facing all sorts of challenges and heartache in his own life. And they're asking him, why'd you bring us out here? Out here, there's no place for grain. There's no place for figs or vines or pomegranates. There's no water to drink. This is a horrible place. Why did you do this? In verse 6, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meetings and fell on their faces. They went before the Lord again. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. He met them in this place. Look at verse 7. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying this, take the staff in the assembly of the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. Moses loved them. And this time, instead of striking the rock like we did 40 years ago, this time I want you to speak to the rock. They're going to see the power of God, that we'll do it just by speaking it. In verse 9 and 10, it's tragic. He says, and Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. And then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, and you can hear his frustration here. He wasn't a perfect leader. He's mad. He's hurt. He's tired. He's grieving. And he says, hear now, you rebels. Now, were they rebels? Of course they were. But all of a sudden, he turned from loving them to being angry at them. He says, hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? It says, and Moses lifted up his hand, and he struck the rock with his staff twice. Can you just imagine? I think Moses, he's mad. And he knows that God had said, speak to the rock, but he's mad. You rebels. And he takes his staff, and twice he hits the rock. Once, twice, have it. I think he's saying to the people. And look at this, and it says, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. But now look at this, verse 12 is maybe one of the most tragic in the entire scriptures. And the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, because you did not believe me, because you did not trust me, because you did not obey me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Not only did you not believe me, but you didn't demonstrate and model what leadership among my people is all about. Because they saw you do what I asked you not to do. He says, you didn't uphold my holiness in front of my people. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Moses, I know you've been traveling around for 40 years, leading this people, waiting to enter into the promised land. And because of their faithlessness, because of their lack of trust, we've wandered for 40 years, but we're coming to the end of that. But Moses, you don't get to go. And the amazing thing is this, is that Moses didn't whine about it. He understood. He got it. Now, you guys, I want to go to the end of Moses' life here. And look at Deuteronomy chapter 34. So they've come to the river Jordan that they're going to pass over into the promised land. And it says this in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo. It's this high mountain across the river to the east of Jordan, looking into Israel, into this promised land. He goes on there on the top of Pisgah, which is opposite of Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land. Can you imagine this? Says, you've been waiting 40 years for this. I want you to see it. So he showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, from the top to the bottom. All Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, from north to south, from west to east. I want you to see it all. I want you to see the Negeb in the south and the plain. That is the valley of Jericho. The city of palm trees is what it's known as. As far as Zoar, I want you to see it all. And the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, and to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there, because you didn't obey. You didn't honor me in your own heart and in the hearts of your people. Wow. Now look at this in verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him. It means God buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite of Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial, even to this day, because people would have made it a shrine. And so God buried him privately. And it says, and the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. But then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. In verse 9, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And so the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there, look at this, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. Now circle this. Whom the Lord knew face to face. Is that an amazing thought? God knew him, and he knew God face to face, intimately, heart to heart, face to face. The Lord knew him, and Moses knew God. Verse 11 says, there's none like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his servants and all of his land. and for all the mighty power and all the revered deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel. There's no one like him. He is preeminent in all of the scriptures. In the Old Testament, only David and he are kind of at this level. And here's a man who knew God personally, deeply, intimately. In fact, what are some things that we could take out of this? Here's just 5 thoughts. First of all, imperfect people can have an intimate relationship with God. Moses wasn't perfect. Amazing guy, yes, of course. Different seasons of life, God did certain things to develop him. But imperfect people like Moses can have an intimate relationship with God. That's you and that's me. That can happen for us too. Here's another thought. God's sovereignty and his providence are purposed to establish maturity through the seasons and even the pain of our lives. You see, God is wanting to grow us, grow our maturity through all these difficult things. In Moses, he did it for 40 years in privilege and in power, but also in the pain. He did it in the middle part of his life as he retreated, and he was reformed, but he was reluctant. And in the next 40 years of his life, he did it as a leader and as a lover, but also experiencing incredible loss. You see, he's establishing maturity in our lives. Here's another thought. God's sovereignty and providence are purposed to use you to build the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. That he wants to, in the unique way he uses your life, and he builds your life and governs over your life to help you build his kingdom right here as it is in heaven. Isn't that what we pray in the Lord's Prayer? Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And he wants to do that. And he is doing that. Next, God's sovereignty and providence do not guarantee smooth sailing or the avoidance of difficulty. I think we see that clearly in Moses' life. He doesn't make it all easy. In fact, he leads him into difficulty. I want you to go back and I want you to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no way. And Moses had to stand up to that and walk through that and deal with that and lead a bunch of grumbling, angry people for 40 years. See, God's sovereignty and providence doesn't guarantee smooth sailing. Sometimes the opposite. And also, God's sovereignty and providence, it does guarantee that there is hope in the midst of all the tragedies and calamities of life, even inside the coronavirus. He gives us hope because he is at work. He is doing something. And sometimes we see it and understand it, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes he does it in the different seasons of our lives as he builds certain things. And we never get perfect, and we struggle, and we make our mistakes, but God is still at work in the midst of all of it to give us hope. Well, I think Moses' life describes that. Guess what? That can describe our lives too. And so I trust that God will use the life of Moses to encourage you in your life too. All right, I'm going to let you close yourselves at home. Just pray together. Pray that God's hope would fill your life with his sovereignty and his providence and the unique things that he's doing right now, whether you understand them or not, to give your hearts to him in the midst of where you're at. All right, love you guys. Pray together.